The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Susanna Bell had sold nearly everything she owned to afford passage west, clutching a deed to a sawmill she had never seen in a town she had never visited, in the shadow of mountains her father had loved more than he had ever loved her. It was the autumn of 1878, and the train from St. Louis rattled and groaned through the Colorado foothills like an old man complaining about his joints. Susanna pressed her gloved hand against the window glass, watching the aspen trees blaze gold against the darker green of the pines, and told herself that this was simply business. She was 26 years old, a widow of 2 years, and she had learned the hard way that sentiment did not pay debts. The sawmill her father had built and run for 15 years in the small settlement of Pine Hollow was, according to the lawyer's letter, worth a considerable sum to the right buyer. She intended to be businesslike about the whole affair. She would arrive, she would assess the property, she would find a buyer, and she would return to civilization with enough money to open the dress shop she had always dreamed of. She had not seen her father in 8 years. Not since the argument that had sent her east to live with her aunt, not since the words that had passed between them like knives, words about her mother's death and who was to blame for it, words that could never quite be taken back no matter how many years passed. When the lawyer's letter had come, informing her that Elias Bell had died of a fever the previous spring, she had felt grief, yes, but also a strange, guilty relief that the argument was finally, permanently over. There would be no reconciliation now. There would only be the settling of accounts. The train depot at Pine Hollow was little more than a wooden platform and a water tower, and when Susanna stepped down onto the dusty boards, valise in hand, she felt suddenly and completely alone. The town spread out before her in a modest cluster of buildings along a single main street, a saloon, a general store, a church with a crooked steeple, and beyond it all, the dark green wall of the mountains rising up like a promise or a threat, she could not decide which. "Miss Bell." A voice called out, and she turned to see a portly man in a bowler hat hurrying toward her, his mustache twitching with the effort of his smile. "I am Mr. Abernathy, your father's lawyer." "I trust your journey was tolerable." "Tolerable enough," Susanna said, extending her hand. "I would like to see the mill as soon as possible, Mr. Abernathy. I do not intend to stay in Pine Hollow any longer than necessary." Abernathy's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Of course. Though I should warn you, the mill has not operated since your father's passing. There has been some difficulty with the workers, and the land itself has suffered from certain complications." "What sort of complications?" "It would be better to see for yourself," Abernathy said, gesturing toward a waiting wagon. "I have arranged for someone to drive you out there. He knows the land better than anyone in these parts." The someone in question was leaning against the wagon when Susanna approached, and she found herself pausing mid-step at the sight of him. He was tall, taller than any man she had seen in St. Louis, with shoulders that strained against the fabric of his flannel shirt and forearms roped with muscle that spoke of a life spent in hard labor rather than parlors and offices. His hair was dark and a touch too long, curling slightly at the collar in a way that suggested he had little patience for barbers, and his jaw was shadowed with several days' growth of beard. He watched her approach with pale gray eyes that seemed to take her measure in a single glance, and something in that gaze made her stand a little straighter. "Miss Bell," Abernathy said, "this is Warren Monroe. He has a cabin up near your father's property and has been keeping an eye on the mill since Elias passed." "Mr. Monroe," Susanna said, offering a cool nod. "Ma'am," Warren replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. He did not smile, did not offer his hand, simply studied her for a long moment before turning to help her into the wagon. His grip on her elbow was gentle despite the obvious strength in it, and she felt an unwelcome warmth spread up her arm at the contact. "I understand you were acquainted with my father," she said, once they had left the small collection of buildings behind and the wagon was rattling along a rutted trail into the trees. "I was," Warren said. "Good man. Stubborn as a mule about some things, but good. Stubborn, Susanna repeated. Yes, that sounds like him. Warren glanced at her sideways. You don't sound too broken up about his passing, if you don't mind me saying. I do mind you saying, Susanna replied, more sharply than she intended. You did not know our history, Mr. Monroe. My father and I were estranged for many years before his death. I'm here to settle his affairs, not to mourn a man I barely knew in his later years. Warren did not respond to that, though she thought she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of understanding or perhaps sympathy that he quickly masked. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels crunching over fallen pine needles, the air growing cooler and cleaner as they climbed higher into the foothills. Susanna found herself studying the landscape, despite her determination to remain unmoved by it. The mountains here were different from anything she had known in the east, ancient and vast, dotted with stands of aspen that shivered gold in the wind, their leaves catching the afternoon light like scattered coins. How far is the mill? She asked. Another hour's ride, Warren said. Your father built it along Cutter's Creek where the water runs fast enough to turn the wheel most of the year. It was a fine operation once. Once, Warren's jaw tightened. You'll see for yourself soon enough. They arrived just as the afternoon light was beginning to slant golden through the trees, and Susanna's first sight of her father's sawmill was not what she had expected. She had imagined something grand, or at least functional, a testament to the 15 years he had poured into this land instead of into their relationship. Instead, she saw a structure in clear disrepair, the great water wheel hanging crooked and still, half its wooden slats rotted through. The main building's roof had partially collapsed on one side, and weeds had grown up thick around the loading platform where lumber had once been stacked for transport. Good Lord, Susanna breathed, climbing down from the wagon before Warren could assist her. Your father's health failed him near the end, Warren said quietly, coming to stand beside her. The mill fell into neglect right along with him. I tried to keep the worst of it from happening, patched the roof best I could, kept the wheel from washing away entirely, but I'm no sawmill man, ma'am. I do what I can with what I know. Susanna walked closer, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground near the creek. The water still ran fast and clear, tumbling over rocks with a sound that was almost musical, and she found herself momentarily distracted by the beauty of it before she caught herself and returned her attention to the ruined buildings. This is worth considerably less than the lawyer led me to believe, she said. Depends on what you're measuring, Warren replied. I am measuring dollars, Mr. Monroe. That is generally how one measures property intended for sale. Something flashed in Warren's gray eyes, quick and sharp as lightning. You mean to sell this place? That is precisely why I am here. Susanna turned to face him fully, lifting her chin. I have no interest in running a sawmill, Mr. Monroe, and even less interest in remaining in Pine Hollow. I intend to find a buyer, settle my father's debts, and return east as soon as possible. Warren was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the creek, the trees, the broken mill itself, as though he were seeing something she could not. Your father spent his whole life building this place, he said finally. Spent his last years watching it fall apart because his body gave out before his will did. Seems a shame to see it sold off to some fool who'll strip the timber and leave nothing but stumps behind. That is not my concern, Susanna said, though something in his words made her uneasy in a way she could not quite name. I did not ask my father to leave me this burden. I have my own life to attend to. Course you do, Warren said, and though his tone remained even, she caught the edge of judgment beneath it. He turned and began walking toward the mill building, his long strides eating up the distance easily. Come on, then. Since you're here, you might as well see the whole of what you're planning to sell. Susanna followed, irritation prickling beneath her skin, though she could not entirely dismiss the curiosity that pulled at her as well. As they walked through the ruined mill, Warren pointed out features with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent considerable time here. the main saw blade still intact beneath a layer of rust, the log flume that once carried timber down from the higher slopes, the small office where her father had apparently kept his accounts, now home to a family of mice judging by the droppings scattered across the floor. He built all this himself? Susanna asked, running her fingers along the edge of a workbench, feeling the grain of the wood beneath years of dust. Started it himself back in '63, Warren said. Employed a dozen men at its peak. Whole town depended on this mill for lumber, for jobs. When it stopped running, a lot of folks in Pine Hollow felt the pinch. I did not know that. There's a lot you don't know, seems like, Warren said, though not unkindly. He gestured toward a small building set apart from the main mill, its roof in better condition than the rest. That's the house. Your father lived there the whole time he ran the place, even after your mother passed. Susanna's breath caught slightly at the mention of her mother, and Warren seemed to notice, his expression softening a fraction. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories. It is fine, Susanna said, though her voice was tighter than she intended. My mother has been gone a long time. They stood in silence for a moment, the creek burbling behind them, a hawk calling somewhere overhead. Susanna found herself studying Warren's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the afternoon light caught the gray of his eyes and made them look almost silver. He was, she admitted reluctantly to herself, one of the most striking men she had ever encountered, though striking in a rough, elemental way that had nothing to do with the polished gentleman she had known back east. Why do you care so much what happens to this place? She asked finally. You said yourself you're no Sawmill man. Warren was quiet for a long moment before answering. My family had land once back in Kentucky, before the war took most everything we had. Watched my own father lose it all to men who saw nothing but dollar signs where other folks saw home. Guess I've got a soft spot for land that's been cared for, even when it's fallen on hard times. This valley, this creek, this mill, it's worth more than what some buyer might pay for the timber rights. Susanna felt something shift in her chest at his words, an unexpected understanding that she was not prepared for. I am sorry for what happened to your family, she said quietly. Long time ago now, Warren said, though the shadow in his eyes suggested it was not so easily forgotten. Come on, sun's getting low. I'll take you back to town and you can decide what you want to do from there. House up at the mill is livable enough if you'd rather stay closer while you sort things out, though it'll need a good cleaning first. Susanna considered this as they walked back toward the wagon. The thought of staying in the small house where her father had lived out his final years, surrounded by the wreckage of his life's work, was not appealing. But the alternative, staying in whatever passed for a hotel in Pine Hollow, surrounded by strangers who had known her father in ways she never had, seemed equally uncomfortable. I will consider it, she said finally, and Warren nodded, offering no further comment as he helped her back into the wagon. The ride back to town passed mostly in silence, though Susanna found her thoughts returning again and again to the ruined mill, to her father's small house with its single bed and worn furniture, to the strange mixture of grief and anger that had settled in her chest since arriving in Pine Hollow. She had come here expecting to feel nothing but the cold satisfaction of settling a debt owed. She had not expected to feel the weight of a life she had never known, a father who had apparently built something meaningful even as he failed to maintain the relationships that mattered most. She had also not expected to feel the pull of curiosity toward the mountain man beside her, with his rough hands and quiet strength, and the surprising depth of feeling he had shown for a piece of land that was not even his own. That night, Susanna took a room at the small boarding house in Pine Hollow, run by a widow named Mrs. Caldwell, who seemed entirely too interested in the details of Susanna's business with the sawmill. Over a simple supper of stew and bread, Mrs. Caldwell shared stories of Elias Bell that painted a picture Susanna had never known, a man who had extended credit to struggling families, who had employed men others had turned away, who had spent his Sunday afternoons teaching the town's children to fish in Cutter's Creek. He talked about you, you know, Mrs. Caldwell said, refilling Susanna's coffee cup. Not often, mind you. He wasn't a man given to sharing his sorrows. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he'd mention his daughter back east, wonder how you were faring. He could have written, Susanna said, more bitterly than she intended. He could have tried to mend things between us. Pride's a heavy thing to carry, Miss Bell, Mrs. Caldwell said gently. I imagine he thought there'd be time enough to fix things later. Most folks think that, until there isn't any time left at all. Susanna said nothing, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest as she retired to her room that night. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain town, an owl calling somewhere in the darkness, the distant howl of what might have been a wolf, and found her thoughts circling back again and again to the mountain man with his silver eyes and his fierce, protective feelings about land that had nothing to do with him. The next morning, Susanna found Warren Monroe waiting outside the boarding house, leaning against a hitching post with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting on mountain weather and wild animals. He straightened as she emerged, offering a nod of greeting. Thought you might want to see the rest of the property in daylight, he said. There's more to it than just the mill building itself. Timber rights extend up the mountain a fair piece, and there's good grazing land along the lower meadow too. I appreciate the thoroughness, Mr. Monroe, but I have already decided to sell. Additional information about the property's features seems unnecessary. Maybe, Warren said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely agree. Still, seems only right you should know what you're selling before some fast-talking buyer convinces you it's worth half what it actually is. Despite herself, Susanna found the logic in this, and she allowed Warren to help her into the wagon once again, trying to ignore the way his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary at her elbow, the way her skin seemed to warm beneath even that brief contact. They spent the morning touring the property in more detail, Warren pointing out the boundaries of the timber rights, the small stream that fed into Cutter's Creek from a higher elevation, the meadow where deer grazed in the early morning light. Susanna found herself, despite her determination to remain unmoved, drawn into the beauty of the land in a way she had not expected. The mountains here possessed a raw, untamed majesty that made the carefully manicured parks of St. Louis seem pale by comparison. It is beautiful country, she admitted finally, as they paused near a rocky overlook that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. I will grant you that much. Your father thought so too, Warren said. Used to come up here most evenings just to watch the sunset. Said it reminded him why he'd stayed, even after your mother passed and things got hard. Did he ever mention regretting things? Susanna asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The way things ended between us, I mean. Warren was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those pale gray eyes that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. I won't lie to you, Miss Bell. Your father wasn't a man who spoke easily about his regrets. But there were nights I'd find him sitting on that porch of his, staring off toward the eastern horizon like he was trying to see clear to wherever you'd gone. I think he carried more sorrow than he ever let on. Susanna felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, and she turned away, blinking rapidly against the emotion. It does not change anything now, she said, though her voice wavered slightly. He is gone, and there is nothing left to say between us. No, Warren agreed quietly. But that doesn't mean the sorrow doesn't count for something. They stood in silence for a while longer, the wind stirring the pine branches around them, the valley spread out below in all its autumn glory. Susanna found herself acutely aware of Warren's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his large frame despite the coolness of the mountain air, the steady, patient way he seemed to simply exist in this landscape without trying to conquer or change it. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Monroe, she said finally, surprising herself with the request. How did you come to settle in these mountains? Warren's expression shifted, something guarded creeping into his eyes. Not much to tell. Came west after the war, tried my hand at a few things, mining mostly, before settling into trapping and hunting up here. Found I preferred the quiet of the mountains to the noise of town living. You never married. The question felt bold even as she asked it, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. Was engaged once, Warren said, his voice carrying a note of old pain. Back in Kentucky before the war took everything. She didn't wait for me to come back, married another man while I was still fighting. Can't blame her much, times were hard and I was gone a long while. He paused, glancing at Susanna with an expression she could not quite read. Guess I never found reason to trust my heart to anyone else after that. Something in his words resonated uncomfortably with her own experience, the way loss and betrayal could harden a person against future vulnerability. I understand that feeling better than you might expect, she said quietly. My husband died 2 years ago. Fever took him quick, barely 3 days from healthy to gone. I have not found much reason to trust in anything since. Warren's gaze softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Bell. Losing someone that sudden, that's its own kind of hard. Yes, Susanna agreed. Though I suppose we all carry our own losses in one form or another. They returned to town shortly after, though Susanna found herself thinking about their conversation throughout the afternoon as she met with Mr. Abernathy to discuss the practical matters of selling her father's property. The lawyer presented several potential buyers, men from larger operations in Denver who were interested primarily in the timber rights and had little interest in restoring the mill itself. This one, Abernathy said, sliding a letter across his desk, represents the Cutter Timber Company. They're prepared to offer a fair price for the land and timber rights, though I should mention they intend to clear-cut the upper slopes rather than maintain any sustainable operation. Susanna read through the offer, noting the substantial sum proposed, more than enough to fund her dress shop and provide comfortable security for years to come. And yet, as she read the details of their intended operations, she found herself thinking of Warren's words from the day before, about land that had been cared for, about the shame of seeing it stripped and abandoned once the timber was gone. What would happen to the mill building itself, she asked. And the house, Abernathy shrugged. Likely torn down or left to rot depending on their needs. Their interest is in the timber, not the existing structures. And the workers you mentioned before, the ones who used to be employed here. I imagine they'd need to seek employment elsewhere, Abernathy said, seeming puzzled by her line of questioning. Miss Bell, forgive me, but I thought your primary interest was in securing the best possible price for the property. This offer represents exactly that. Yes, Susanna said slowly. Yes, of course. I simply wish to understand the full scope of the arrangement. She left Abernathy's office with the offer folded carefully in her reticule, though she found herself unable to shake a growing sense of unease about the decision before her. That evening, she found herself walking the length of Pine Hollow's Main Street, past the general store and the small church, past the saloon where laughter and piano music spilled out into the darkening evening. She passed several townsfolk who nodded politely, though she noticed more than a few curious glances directed her way. The daughter of Elias Bell, come at last to settle his affairs. An older man emerged from the general store as she passed, tipping his hat respectfully. Miss Bell, I'm Tom Whitfield. Used to work at your father's mill back before it shut down. Susanna paused, studying the weathered face before her. Mr. Whitfield, I understand my father employed quite a few men from town. Best boss I ever had, Whitfield said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. Paid fair wages, never docked a man's pay for taking sick, even helped out my family when my wife took ill a few winters back. Whole town felt it hard when the mill shut down. A lot of us have had to travel to Denver for work since, leaving our families behind for months at a time. I did not realize the mill's closure had affected the town so significantly, Susanna said, feeling the weight of this new information settling uncomfortably in her chest. Your father built more than just a business here, Miss Bell, Whitfield said. He built a community. I know you two had your differences. Everyone in town knew that much. But whatever happened between you, I hope you know he was a good man who cared deeply about this place and its people. Susanna thanked Whitfield for his kind words, though she found herself troubled as she continued her walk. The picture forming of her father, a man beloved by his community, generous with his workers, devoted to the land he had cultivated, stood in stark contrast to the distant, cold figure she remembered from her childhood. The man who had blamed her, however unfairly, for her mother's death, who had sent her away rather than face his own grief. She found herself at the edge of town as darkness fully settled, standing near a small cemetery she had not previously noticed. A simple wooden marker caught her eye, and she approached to find her father's grave, the earth still relatively fresh despite the months that had passed since his death. Someone had planted wildflowers around the marker, now withering with the approaching winter, and she wondered who had shown such care for a grave she had not thought to visit until now. "Warren Monroe planted those," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find Mrs. Caldwell approaching, a shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. "Comes by every week or so, tends the grave, makes sure it's kept proper. Your father didn't have much family left besides you, and Warren felt someone should look after things." "Why would he care so much?" Susanna asked, genuinely puzzled. "They were not related. He owes my father nothing." "Your father saved his life, Miss Bell," Mrs. Caldwell said quietly. "Few years back, Warren got caught in an avalanche up on the high slopes, would have frozen to death if your father hadn't found him and brought him down to the mill house, nursed him back to health himself. They became close after that, close as family, I'd say. That's likely why Warren feels so strong about seeing the mill preserved, rather than sold off to strangers who'd tear it down without a second thought." This revelation struck Susanna with unexpected force, reshaping her understanding of Warren's investment in the property, his fierce protectiveness that had seemed, until now, somewhat inexplicable. She stood at her father's grave for a long while after Mrs. Caldwell continued on her way, watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling the weight of a life she had never fully understood pressing against her chest like a physical thing. The following morning, Susanna sought out Warren at the mill, finding him repairing a section of fence near the lower meadow, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the impressive muscles of his forearms as he worked, sweat beading along his brow despite the cool autumn air. He looked up as she approached, setting down his hammer. "Miss Bell, wasn't expecting you out this way today. Mrs. Caldwell told me about the avalanche," Susanna said without preamble. "About my father saving your life." Warren's expression grew guarded. "Ma'am, I don't need your pity or your gratitude on account of that. That is not why I mentioned it," Susanna said. "I simply wanted to understand why you have shown such devotion to this place, to my father's memory. It makes more sense to me now." Warren studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Your father was more than an employer to me, Miss Bell. He was the closest thing to family I had left in this world, after everything else was taken from me. When he passed, I felt I owed it to him to look after what he'd built, even knowing it likely wouldn't survive without someone willing to invest the time and money to fix it properly." "And you thought that someone might be me," Susanna said, understanding dawning. "Honestly, I didn't know what to think when Abernathy told me his daughter was coming to settle the estate. Didn't know if you'd care one way or another about this place, or about the people whose livelihoods depend on it running properly again." Susanna considered this, looking out over the meadow where Warren had been working, the mountains rising majestic beyond, the mill visible in the distance with its broken wheel and collapsed roof. "I received an offer yesterday," she said finally, "from a timber company in Denver. They intend to clear-cut the upper slopes, offer more money than the mill and existing structures are likely worth on their own." Warren's jaw tightened. "And you're planning to accept it?" "I have not decided," Susanna admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of this statement. "I came here believing the decision would be simple, that I would sell to whoever offered the most money and return east without a second thought, but I am finding it more complicated than I anticipated. Because of the town, the workers who'd lose their livelihoods. That," Susanna said slowly, "and other things as well." She met his gaze directly, feeling something pass between them that she could not quite name, a recognition of shared understanding, perhaps, or something deeper still. I'm beginning to understand that this place meant more to my father than I ever gave him credit for, and I am beginning to wonder if selling it to strangers who would strip it bare would be a betrayal of everything he tried to build here. Warren's expression shifted, hope flickering in his gray eyes, though he seemed to be trying to contain it. "What are you saying, Miss Bell?" "I am saying that perhaps I need more time to consider my options," Susanna said. "Perhaps there is a way to restore the mill, to honor what my father built without simply selling it off to the first buyer who offers a substantial sum. That would take considerable investment," Warren said carefully. "Money, time, labor. It wouldn't be easy, and there's no guarantee of success." "No," Susanna agreed, "but perhaps some things are worth the risk, even without guarantees." They stood in silence for a moment, the autumn wind rustling through the meadow grass, and Susanna found herself acutely aware of the distance, or lack thereof, between them. Warren was close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, could smell the scent of pine and honest sweat that clung to him from his morning's labor. Something in the air between them felt charged, significant, though neither of them moved to close the remaining distance. "I should return to town," Susanna said finally, breaking the moment. "I have much to consider." "Of course," Warren said, though she thought she detected reluctance in his voice as she turned to leave. Over the following days, Susanna found herself drawn increasingly to the mill property, sometimes accompanied by Warren, sometimes venturing there alone on a horse she had rented from the local stable. She began to see the land not as a burden to be disposed of, but as something with genuine potential, if only someone were willing to invest the necessary effort. She spoke with several of the former mill workers, learning more about the operation her father had run, the specific equipment needed for repairs, the timeline that might be involved in restoring the mill to working order. Warren proved invaluable during this process, not only for his intimate knowledge of the property, but for his steady presence, his willingness to answer her endless questions, his obvious respect for the land and its history. Susanna found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the easy companionship that had developed between them, despite their initial wariness of each other. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of the small house near the mill, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese that Warren had brought, Susanna found herself studying his profile as he gazed out toward the mountains, his expression thoughtful and calm. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Monroe?" she said. "You may," Warren replied, turning to meet her gaze, "though I reserve the right not to answer if it strikes too close to old wounds." "Fair enough," Susanna said, a small smile touching her lips. "I was simply wondering, after your engagement ended so painfully, did you ever consider leaving these mountains? Starting fresh somewhere else, away from memories that might remind you of what you'd lost?" Warren considered this for a long moment. "Thought about it plenty in the early years, but something about these mountains, the quiet of them, the way they don't ask anything of you except respect and patience, it helped me heal in ways I don't think I could have found elsewhere. Leaving felt like it would mean running from something rather than moving toward anything better." "That makes sense," Susanna said quietly. "I think I understand that feeling better than I did when I first arrived here." "And you," Warren asked, "after your husband passed, did you consider staying in St. Louis or moving elsewhere entirely?" "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, no other plans that made sense," Susanna admitted. "But I do not think I ever truly healed from his loss, not the way you seem to have healed from yours. I simply learned to function despite the grief, to build walls around my heart that would prevent further hurt." "And now?" Warren asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that made her breath catch slightly. "Do you still feel those walls as strongly as you did when you first arrived in Pine Hollow?" Susanna met his gaze directly, feeling something shift and soften within her chest, a vulnerability she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "I confess, Mr. Monroe, that my walls have proven less sturdy than I anticipated since arriving here. Something about this place, about the people I have met, has begun to erode my careful defenses in ways I did not expect." Warren's expression grew intense, his gray eyes darkening with an emotion that made her pulse quicken. "Susanna," he said, using her given name for the first time, his voice rough with feeling. "I would be lying if I said I hadn't felt something similar these past weeks. Watching you come to understand this land, this town, your father's legacy, it stirred something in me I thought long buried after Kentucky." The intimacy of the moment felt almost overwhelming, and Susanna found herself leaning slightly closer to him without conscious decision, drawn by a magnetic pull she could no longer deny. "Warren," she said softly, testing the feel of his given name on her tongue. "I do not know what to make of these feelings that have developed between us. It seems impossibly fast, impossibly complicated given the circumstances." "Maybe it doesn't need to make sense right away," Warren said, his large hand coming up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb brushing softly against her skin. "Maybe some things just need time to grow naturally, the way this valley grows its wildflowers each spring, without forcing or rushing." Susanna closed her eyes briefly at his touch, savoring the warmth and gentleness of it despite the obvious strength contained within his calloused palm. "I have been hurt before," she whispered. "I do not know if I have the courage to risk that kind of vulnerability again." "I understand that fear better than most," Warren said. "But I promise you, Susanna, whatever happens between us, whatever you decide about this land and your future, I will not add to your hurt. You deserve nothing less than complete honesty and respect." The sincerity in his voice, the genuine care evident in his expression, broke through the last of her defenses, and Susanna found herself closing the remaining distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, before deepening as the weeks of building tension and unspoken feeling found their release. Warren's arms came around her, strong and protective, pulling her closer against his solid chest, and Susanna felt, for the first time in years, a sense of safety and belonging that she had thought lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing slightly unsteadily, Warren rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I've wanted to do that since the day you climbed down from that train," he admitted, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Fought against it something fierce, telling myself it wasn't proper, that you had important business to attend to and didn't need a rough mountain man complicating things further." Susanna laughed softly, surprising herself with the lightness of the sound. "I confess I had similar thoughts, though I convinced myself my reaction to you was simply professional curiosity about your knowledge of the property." "Professional curiosity," Warren repeated, amusement clear in his tone. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Perhaps not entirely accurate," Susanna admitted, and they both laughed, the sound carrying easily across the quiet meadow, mixing with the distant call of birds and the ever-present music of the creek. As the golden days of autumn began to shorten, Susanna found herself increasingly committed to the idea of restoring her father's sawmill rather than selling it to the timber company. She wrote to Abernathy, declining the Denver offer, and began the more complicated process of understanding what restoration might actually require, both in terms of physical labor and financial investment. Warren proved essential to this process, not only for his physical strength and knowledge of the land, but for his connections throughout the mountain community, men who owed favors or possessed skills that might prove useful. Together, they began assembling a plan, meeting with the former mill workers to gauge their interest in returning to work once the mill was operational again, calculating costs for materials and equipment, discussing timelines that stretched realistically into the following spring and summer. "It will not be easy," Susanna said one evening, as they reviewed figures by lamplight in the small office at the mill, the numbers spread across her father's old desk. "The costs are considerable and I have limited resources to draw upon." "We'll find a way," Warren said with quiet confidence. "This community has a way of pulling together when something matters enough. Your father knew that better than anyone. "I am beginning to understand that about him," Susanna said softly, "though I wish I had understood it while he was still alive to appreciate the sentiment." Warren reached across the desk, covering her hand with his own. He knew Susanna. "Men like your father, they might not say the words easy, but they feel things deep all the same. I'd wager he never stopped hoping you'd find your way back here someday, even if he didn't have the words to ask for it directly." Tears pricked at Susanna's eyes, and she did not try to hide them this time, allowing herself the vulnerability of grief that she had suppressed for so long. Warren moved around the desk to gather her into his arms, holding her while she cried, offering silent comfort rather than empty words. When her tears finally subsided, she felt lighter somehow, as though some long-carried burden had finally found release. "Thank you," she said softly, pulling back slightly to meet his gaze, "for helping me see him more clearly, even now that it's too late to make amends directly." "It's never too late to honor someone's memory properly," Warren said. "Restoring this mill, giving this community back what they lost, that's a fine way to make amends, even if he's not here to see it happen." Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into the first frosts of early winter, Susanna and Warren worked tirelessly on their plans for the mill's restoration. They secured a modest loan from the bank in the nearest larger town, using the property itself as collateral, and began the process of ordering necessary materials and equipment. Warren organized the former mill workers, most of whom expressed eager willingness to return once the operation was viable again, and Susanna found herself learning the practical business of running a sawmill with a determination that surprised even herself. Their relationship deepened alongside their shared project, evenings spent working through logistics giving way to quiet moments of growing intimacy, shared meals that stretched into long conversations about their pasts, their hopes, their gradually merging vision for the future. Susanna found herself falling deeply in love with this rough mountain man, drawn not only to his obvious physical strength and undeniable attractiveness, but to the depth of character revealed through his patience, his loyalty, his genuine care for the land and community he had adopted as his own. For his part, Warren found himself increasingly captivated by Susanna's transformation, watching the guarded, businesslike woman who had first arrived in Pine Hollow gradually give way to someone more open, more vulnerable, more willing to invest her heart in something larger than herself. He admired her intelligence, her growing understanding of practical matters related to the mill's operation, and most of all, her willingness to reconsider deeply held beliefs when confronted with new understanding about her father's legacy. One crisp November afternoon, as the first significant snow began to dust the higher peaks, Warren took Susanna up to the overlook where they had first discussed her father's evening habits, the sweeping view of the valley now painted in the muted colors of approaching winter. He had brought a simple picnic, and they sat together on a blanket spread across the rocky outcropping, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western peaks. "I've been thinking," Warren said, his voice carrying a nervousness that seemed unusual for him. "About the future, I mean. About what happens after the mill is restored, after the immediate work is done." "What have you been thinking?" Susanna asked, curious about this uncharacteristic hesitation in his usually confident manner. Warren turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his much larger ones. "Susanna, these past weeks have shown me something I thought I'd lost forever after Kentucky, the possibility of building a future with someone I love and trust completely. I know we've known each other only a short time, and I know your life before this was different from anything you might find here in these mountains, but I find myself unable to imagine a future that doesn't include you by my side." Susanna's heart raced at his words, understanding the direction of his sentiment even before he continued. "Warren," she breathed. "I love you," Warren said simply, the words carrying weight and sincerity. "I love your strength, your growing understanding of this land, your willingness to honor your father's memory even after everything that passed between you before his death. I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would consider staying here permanently, building a life with me, becoming my wife." Tears filled Susanna's eyes, though these were tears of joy rather than grief. "Warren Monroe," she said softly, "I came to these mountains intending to sell a piece of land and return quickly to a life I thought I understood. Instead, I have found love, purpose, and a connection to my father's memory that I never expected to discover. I love you as well, completely and without reservation. Yes, I will marry you." Warren's face broke into a genuine smile, the first truly unguarded expression of joy she had seen from him, and he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that spoke of relief and happiness combined. When they finally broke apart, both laughing with the sheer joy of the moment, Warren reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small ring, simple but clearly crafted with care. "I had this made in Denver last week," he admitted, slightly sheepish. "Wasn't sure exactly when I'd work up the courage to ask, but I wanted to be ready when the moment felt right." Susanna extended her hand, allowing him to slide the ring onto her finger, admiring the simple beauty of the setting, a small piece of local turquoise surrounded by delicate silverwork. "It is perfect," she said softly. "Absolutely perfect." They remained at the overlook until the sun had fully set, talking about their future together, about the mill's restoration, about the family they might build in this valley that had already claimed both their hearts so completely. As darkness settled around them, Warren built a small fire, and they sat together beneath the emerging stars, feeling more content and hopeful than either had believed possible just months before. Their engagement was met with genuine joy throughout Pine Hollow, the townsfolk having watched their romance develop with interested approval, understanding the significance of Susanna's decision to stay and invest in the community rather than sell off her father's legacy to distant strangers. Mrs. Caldwell insisted on helping plan the wedding, drawing on her considerable experience with such matters, and even Mr. Abernathy expressed his sincere pleasure at the turn of events, noting that Elias Bell would surely have approved of his daughter's choice. The wedding took place in early December, in the small church with its crooked steeple, decorated with pine boughs, and the last of the season's wildflowers that Warren had carefully preserved. Susanna wore a simple but elegant dress that Mrs. Caldwell had helped her sew, and the entire town seemed to turn out for the celebration, filling the small church beyond capacity and spilling out into the crisp winter air for the reception that followed. As Susanna walked down the short aisle toward Warren, who stood waiting with an expression of pure, unguarded love, she felt the presence of her father somehow, as though his spirit blessed this union that had grown from the very land he had loved so deeply. Warren looked magnificent in a new suit that could not quite disguise the powerful build beneath it, his hair neatly combed for the occasion, though a few stubborn curls had already begun to escape their careful arrangement. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, the local minister speaking of love that grows from unexpected circumstances, of healing found in unlikely places, of second chances that arrive when least expected but most needed. When Warren spoke his vows, his voice carried the same quiet strength and sincerity that had first drawn Susanna to him, promising to protect and cherish her for all their days, to honor the memory of her father through their shared commitment to the land he had built. "I take you, Susanna Bell," Warren said, his gray eyes bright with emotion, "to be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things. I promise to stand beside you through every season, every challenge, every joy this life brings us. I promise to love you as fiercely as these mountains stand, as steadily as that creek runs through our valley, for as long as I draw breath." Susanna's voice trembled slightly with emotion as she offered her own vows. "I take you, Warren Monroe, to be my husband, my protector, my greatest love. I promise to build with you not just a restored mill, but a life filled with honesty, partnership, and deep affection. I promise to honor my father's memory through our shared commitment to this land, and to love you with everything I have to give, for all the days we are blessed to share." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in cheers and applause, and Warren swept Susanna into a kiss that left no doubt about the depth of feeling between them. They emerged from the church to find the entire town had prepared a celebration, tables laden with food, musicians tuning their instruments for dancing, children running excitedly between the adults' legs. The reception stretched long into the evening, filled with dancing and laughter, and the kind of genuine community celebration that Susanna had never experienced in her more formal life back east. She danced with Warren beneath the stars that had begun to emerge as darkness fell, feeling more truly happy than she had believed possible just months before, when she had arrived in Pine Hollow expecting nothing more than a simple business transaction. Winter settled deeply into the mountains following their wedding, and Susanna found herself adapting to the rhythms of mountain life with growing confidence and joy. She and Warren moved into the small house near the mill, working together to make it truly their own, adding small touches that transformed it from her father's solitary dwelling into a home built for two people deeply in love. Warren taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to recognize the different calls of birds that remained through the harsh winter months, to appreciate the particular beauty of moonlight on fresh snow that transformed their valley into something almost magical. Despite the winter weather, they continued working on plans for the mill's restoration, using the quieter months to secure additional materials and finalize arrangements with the workers who would return once construction began in earnest come spring. Warren's practical knowledge combined with Susanna's growing business acumen to create a solid foundation for their shared venture, and by the time the first signs of spring began appearing in the valley, they were ready to begin the actual work of rebuilding. The restoration process proved arduous but deeply satisfying, months of hard labor transforming the ruined structure into something functional and even beautiful. Warren's strength proved invaluable for the heaviest work, hauling timber and repairing the massive water wheel, while Susanna managed the business aspects with increasing confidence, negotiating with suppliers and organizing the returning workforce. Tom Whitfield and several other former employees returned enthusiastically, bringing their own skills and knowledge to bear on the restoration efforts. By early summer, the mill was operational once again, the great water wheel turning steadily as Cutter's Creek provided the power needed to run the saw blade that had sat dormant for so long. The first log process through the restored mill was celebrated with genuine ceremony, the entire community gathering to witness this symbol of renewal and hope. Susanna felt tears of pride and joy as she watched the operation run smoothly, knowing that she had honored her father's legacy in a way she never could have imagined when she first arrived in Pine Hollow with nothing but grief and business intentions. As the mill's operation stabilized and grew profitable, Susanna and Warren found their partnership extending beyond the business itself into a deeper domestic contentment. They spent long evenings on their porch, watching sunsets paint the mountains in brilliant colors, discussing their hopes for the future, for the family they hoped to build together. Warren proved to be not only a devoted husband but a natural partner in every aspect of their shared life, his quiet strength balanced by genuine tenderness whenever Susanna needed comfort or support. By the following spring, Susanna discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both of them with overwhelming joy. Warren's protective instincts, already evident in his care for the land and community, intensified as he watched over Susanna through her pregnancy, ensuring she rested adequately despite her continued involvement in the mill's operations, insisting on handling the more physically demanding tasks himself as her pregnancy progressed. Their son, whom they named Elias in honor of Susanna's father, arrived on a clear autumn morning almost exactly 1 year after their wedding. Warren's joy at witnessing his son's birth was matched only by his obvious relief when the local midwife pronounced both mother and child healthy and strong. Susanna held their newborn son against her chest, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped her own, feeling a completion in her life that she had never dared to imagine possible during those difficult years of grief and estrangement that had preceded her arrival in Pine Hollow. "He has your eyes," Susanna murmured, studying her son's face as Warren sat beside her on their bed, his large frame somehow managing to appear gentle despite his obvious strength. "And your stubborn chin, if I'm not mistaken," Warren replied with a soft laugh, reaching out to gently touch their son's small face. "Going to be quite a combination, this one." As young Elias grew through his infancy and into his toddling years, the mill continued to prosper, expanding its operations to serve not only Pine Hollow but several neighboring settlements as well. Warren and Susanna hired additional workers as demand increased, and Susanna found herself increasingly respected throughout the region as a shrewd businesswoman who had successfully revitalized what many had considered a lost cause. She never forgot the lessons she had learned during those first difficult weeks in Pine Hollow, about the value of community, about second chances, about love that could grow from unexpected circumstances. 2 years after Elias' birth, Susanna gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace, in honor of the graceful way their love had transformed both their lives. Grace grew to be a spirited child, inheriting her mother's determination and her father's deep connection to the natural world around them. The family expanded further with the birth of a third child, another son named Thomas, honoring Tom Whitfield's loyal friendship and support throughout the mill's restoration. As their children grew, Warren and Susanna made a point of teaching them not only practical skills related to the mill's operation, but also the deeper values that had shaped their own journey toward love and partnership. Elias, showing particular interest in the mechanical aspects of the mill's operation, began learning the intricacies of the water wheel and saw mechanisms from an early age, often found alongside his father, small hands attempting to mimic Warren's confident movements as he explained the workings of various tools and machines. Grace, meanwhile, developed a fascination with the business side of operations, often found in the small office reviewing ledgers alongside her mother, asking increasingly sophisticated questions about profit margin and supplier relationships that left Susanna both amused and genuinely impressed by her daughter's natural aptitude for commerce. The years passed with the steady rhythm of mountain seasons, each bringing its own particular beauty and challenges. Susanna never forgot her father, visiting his grave regularly with her children, sharing stories about the man she had come to understand more fully through Warren's memories and the testimonies of the community he had served so faithfully. She made peace, finally and completely, with the estrangement that had once caused her such pain, understanding now that love could take many forms, that regret need not define a legacy when action could transform it into something positive and lasting. Warren, for his part, found in his marriage to Susanna and their growing family the sense of belonging and permanence he had lost so many years before in Kentucky. His protective nature, once channeled primarily into caring for the mountains and their wildlife, expanded to encompass his wife and children with a fierce devotion that never wavered, even as the practical demands of running a successful business occasionally tested their patience and resources. 10 years after their initial meeting, on the anniversary of the day Susanna had first arrived in Pine Hollow, expecting nothing more than a simple business transaction, the family gathered at the overlook where Warren had first proposed, now a tradition they maintained annually to celebrate the love that had transformed all their lives. Elias, now a capable young man of 10, helped his younger siblings navigate the rocky path, while Warren and Susanna followed behind, hand in hand, watching their children with the deep satisfaction of parents who had built something truly meaningful together. "Do you ever regret it?" Warren asked, as they settled onto the familiar blanket, watching their children explore the nearby rocks under Tom Whitfield's watchful eye, for he had become something of an honorary uncle to the family over the years. "Staying here, I mean, instead of returning to the life you originally planned." Susanna considered the question seriously, though her answer came without hesitation. "Not for a single moment," she said, leaning against his solid shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of his strength surrounding her. "I came here expecting to settle a simple business matter, and found instead the deepest love and purpose I could have ever imagined. This land, this community, you and our children, this is my home in every sense that matters." Warren pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, his arms tightening around her slightly. "I fell in love with you that first day," he admitted, something he had shared many times before but which never lost its power to move her. "Watching you climb down from that train, all business and determination, trying so hard to hide the grief you were carrying underneath. I knew even then that you were someone special, someone worth fighting for, even if it took time for both of us to understand exactly what that meant. And I am eternally grateful you did fight for it," Susanna said softly. "For us, for this life we've built together, for the second chance this land offered both of us when we least expected it." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the valley in the same golden light that had first captivated Susanna during her initial visit years before, the family remained together at their special overlook, watching the mill in the distance, its wheels still turning steadily, a testament to the love and dedication that had transformed both a piece of land and two hearts that had once believed themselves too damaged to risk vulnerability again. The sawmill that Elias Bell had built and lost, then found again through his daughter's unexpected journey, stood now as more than just a business operation. It represented the healing power of second chances, the way love could transform grief into purpose, the manner in which a piece of land, properly cared for and cherished, could nurture not just timber and commerce, but the deepest bonds of family and belonging. Susanna often reflected, in quiet moments watching her children grow and thrive in this mountain valley that had become their true home, on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to Pine Hollow, expecting nothing more than a simple business transaction. Instead, she had found love with a mountain man whose quiet strength and fierce devotion had shown her that healing was possible, that second chances existed even after the deepest losses, that a father's legacy could be honored not through grief and distance, but through action and renewed commitment to the values he had held dear. Warren, watching his wife's face illuminated by the setting sun, their children's laughter carrying across the meadow, felt the same overwhelming gratitude he experienced every day since Susanna had agreed to become his wife. The isolation and loneliness that had defined his years in these mountains before her arrival had given way to a rich, full life surrounded by family and purpose, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when given proper time and the right person to share the journey. As darkness began settling over the valley, the family made their way back down from the overlook, Warren carrying young Thomas on his shoulders while Elias and Grace ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the surrounding peaks. Susanna walked beside her husband, her hand secure in his larger one, feeling the deep contentment of a life well lived, a love genuinely earned, and a legacy properly honored through years of dedication and growth. They returned to their home near the mill, the lights glowing warm and welcoming in the gathering darkness, the sound of the creek providing its constant, soothing accompaniment to their evening routines. As they prepared their children for bed, sharing stories of the day's adventures and plans for the following morning, Susanna felt the full weight of her transformation from grieving, guarded widow, to beloved wife and mother, from reluctant heir to devoted steward of land that had once seemed nothing more than a burden to be quickly disposed of. Later that evening, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of their sleeping children and the ever-present music of Cutter's Creek flowing steadily past their home, Warren pulled Susanna close against his chest, his strong arms providing the same sense of security and belonging they had offered since their very first embrace. "I love you," he whispered into her hair, the same words he had spoken countless times over their years together, yet still carrying the same weight and sincerity as they had on that first day at the Overlook. "I love you too," Susanna replied, turning to meet his gaze in the dim moonlight filtering through their window. "More than I ever believed possible, more than I ever thought my heart could hold after everything that came before." They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had for years now, surrounded by the life they had built together in this mountain valley, secure in the knowledge that their love had not only survived but flourished, that the second chance offered by this land and by each other had transformed into something permanent and deeply blessed. The following morning brought its usual busy routine, children waking early and eager for breakfast before the day's activities, Warren heading out to oversee the mill's morning operations, while Susanna managed household affairs and reviewed the previous day's business accounts. Their life had settled into a comfortable, fulfilling rhythm, each day bringing its own small joys and challenges, but always underlaid with the deep foundation of love and partnership they had built together over the years. As Elias approached his teenage years, showing increasing aptitude for the mechanical aspects of mill operations, Warren began formally training him in the various skills necessary to eventually take over management of the business, a legacy that would continue into the next generation, honoring both Elias Bell's original vision and the transformation that Susanna and Warren had achieved together. Grace, meanwhile, continued developing her business acumen, often accompanying her mother on trips to negotiate with suppliers or discuss expansion opportunities with other settlements in the region. Thomas, the youngest, showed a different kind of interest, drawn more toward the natural world that surrounded their home, following Warren on his occasional hunting trips or fishing expeditions along Cutter's Creek, absorbing his father's deep knowledge and respect for the mountain environment that had shaped so much of Warren's own character before Susanna's arrival, had added new dimensions to his previously solitary existence. The mill itself continued to prosper, becoming known throughout the region for both the quality of its lumber and the fair treatment of its workers, values that Susanna had insisted upon from the very beginning, remembering her father's own reputation for generosity and community investment that she had learned about only after his death. She often thought about how proud he would have been to see the operation not only restored, but expanded, serving an even greater purpose than it had during his own tenure managing the property. 10 more years passed in this manner, each bringing its own developments and challenges, but always maintaining the strong foundation of love and partnership that Susanna and Warren had established during those first transformative months of their relationship. Their children grew into capable young adults, each finding their own path while maintaining deep connections to the family business and the mountain community that had shaped their childhood. When Elias eventually married a young woman from a neighboring settlement, taking on increasing responsibility for the mill's daily operations, Warren felt a profound sense of satisfaction watching his son step into a role that honored both his grandfather's original vision and his parents' successful restoration efforts. Grace, meanwhile, had established herself as a shrewd negotiator, expanding the business's reach into several new markets throughout Colorado, while Thomas had taken up a position as a respected guide for hunting expeditions throughout the region, his deep knowledge of the mountains earning him considerable reputation among visitors seeking authentic wilderness experiences. Susanna and Warren, now grandparents themselves as their children began starting their own families, found themselves reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought them together, transformed a piece of neglected land into a thriving business and community asset, and created a legacy that would continue benefiting future generations. They maintained their tradition of visiting the overlook each year on their anniversary, now often accompanied by grandchildren eager to hear the story of how their grandparents had fallen in love amid the challenges of restoring an old sawmill. "Tell us again," young grandchildren would beg, gathered around Warren's feet as he sat on the familiar rocky outcropping, Susanna beside him with the same loving expression she had worn since their very first kiss so many years before. "Tell us how Grandpa convinced Grandma to stay." Warren would smile, his hair now touched with gray but his frame still impressively strong despite the passing years, and begin the familiar tale of a woman who had arrived expecting to sell a broken-down mill, only to discover love, purpose, and a home she had never known she was seeking. Susanna would add her own perspective, describing the mountain man whose quiet strength and fierce devotion to the land had shown her that second chances existed even after the deepest losses, that healing was possible when given proper time and the right person to share the journey. As the sun set over their beloved valley, painting the mountains in the same golden light that had first captivated Susanna during her initial arrival so many years before, the family would make their way back down to the mill and their home, the sound of laughter and love carrying across the meadow just as it had for decades now, a testament to the enduring power of a love that had transformed not just two hearts, but an entire community and a legacy that would continue benefiting generations to come. The mill continued operating for many more years, eventually passing formally into Elia's capable management, while Warren and Susanna enjoyed their retirement in the same small house they had first shared as newlyweds, now expanded and improved through years of loving care, much like their marriage itself. They remained deeply devoted to each other until their final days, their love story becoming something of a local legend, told and retold throughout Pine Hollow as an example of how tragedy and loss could transform into something beautiful and lasting when met with courage, openness, and a willingness to embrace unexpected second chances. Susanna often thought, in quiet moments of reflection during her later years, about the strange twist of fate that had sent her west with nothing more than grief and business intentions, only to discover the deepest love and most meaningful purpose of her entire life. She had arrived intending to sever all connection to a father she believed she barely knew, only to find, through that very journey, a deeper understanding of his character and values than she could have gained any other way. She had planned to sell a broken piece of land to the highest bidder, only to discover that some things possessed value far beyond mere dollars and commerce, value measured instead in community, in legacy, in the transformative power of love properly nurtured and allowed to grow. Warren, for his part, never stopped feeling grateful for the day Susanna Bell had climbed down from that train, all business and hidden grief, unknowingly beginning a journey that would transform both their lives completely. The isolation he had carried since his broken engagement in Kentucky had given way to a rich, full life surrounded by family, community, and purpose, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when given proper time, patience, and the courage to risk vulnerability once again. Their love story, born from the unlikely combination of a woman's business obligation and a mountain man's fierce devotion to land he had come to consider sacred, had grown into something far greater than either could have imagined during those first wary interactions at the ruined sawmill. It had become a testament to the power of second chances, to the way healing could emerge from unexpected sources, and to the deep, abiding truth that love, properly nurtured and honestly pursued, could transform not just individual hearts, but entire communities and legacies that would continue benefiting generations far into the future. And so, in the shadow of the same mountains that had witnessed their first meeting, their growing love, and their ultimate commitment to each other, and to the land that had brought them together, Susanna Bell and Warren Monroe lived out their days in deep contentment, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by a thriving business built on the foundation of respect and community investment, and by a love story that had begun with a simple business transaction and blossomed into the greatest treasure either had ever known. Their legacy endured not just in the continued operation of the restored sawmill, but in the values they had instilled in their children, the community they had helped sustain and grow, and the enduring truth that sometimes the greatest second chances arrive precisely when we least expect them, disguised as simple obligations that transform, through courage and openness, into the deepest and most meaningful love of a lifetime.